Welcome back to Black Arena, where we uncover the stories they don't want told. California has just made history, and it's about to change everything you thought you knew about wealth in America. A state task force has recommended something unprecedented, up to $1.5 million in reparations for every eligible black resident. But before you form an opinion, you need to understand the numbers behind this decision. Numbers that reveal the greatest economic cover-up in human history. Here's the truth. They've been hiding for centuries. African Americans weren't poor because they failed at capitalism. They were systematically excluded from it, robbed of it, and murdered for attempting it. Let me show you exactly how this theft happened, and why the bill is finally coming due. Picture this. It's 1865, the year the Emancipation Proclamation supposedly freed 4 million enslaved people. At that moment, black Americans controlled just half of 1% of the nation's total wealth. Now, fast forward to today, 2025, after 160 years of supposed freedom and opportunity, that number still under 2%. Think about that for a moment. In the wealthiest nation ever created, an entire race of people who built the foundation of that wealth still owns almost nothing. This isn't an accident of history. This is the result of the most successful theft operation ever conducted. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. While the average white household today holds approximately $171,000 in assets, the average black family has just $17,000. That's not a gap. That's financial apartheid by design, and if you think that's shocking, wait until you hear this calculation. If the United States government had simply paid minimum wage for the 246 years of forced labor, it would owe over $24 trillion in back wages. Not reparations, not charity, wages. Money that was earned but never paid. But instead of paying the workers, guess who got compensated when slavery ended? The slave owners, the federal government, actually paid reparations to the people who had committed the crime. Imagine that level of injustice. You're beaten, sold, and worked to death, and your captor gets paid for losing you. If you're just discovering this channel, make sure to subscribe, because we're diving deep into the stories that mainstream media won't touch. Every major American institution cashed in on this system. Those plantation owners, they became politicians. The slave traders, they founded banks that still exist today. Insurance companies wrote policies on human beings like they were livestock. Universities built entire endowments from slave trade profits. JP Morgan, Aetna, Wells Fargo, these aren't ancient companies. They're your mortgage lender, your insurance provider, your investment firm. This is why the comparison works so perfectly. If America were a bank, black people made the deposit, built the vault, armed the security, and have never been allowed to make a withdrawal. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, newspapers declared slavery over. But for millions of black Americans, this was just the beginning of a new nightmare. There were no land grants, number housing assistance, no educational opportunities, just the same fields, the same cotton, the same exploitation, now disguised as employment contracts. Think about the economics of slavery for a moment. By 1860, enslaved people represented more wealth than all the banks, railroads, and factories in America combined. They weren't considered human beings. They were walking capital. Slave owners could mortgage black lives to secure bank loans. Insurance companies wrote policies protecting these investments. Universities accepted donations built on slave labor profits, and when slavery officially ended, those profits didn't vanish. They just changed hands. The same families kept the land, the same institutions kept the money, and the people who had actually created all that wealth, they were abandoned with nothing but freedom on paper. Worse still, many were immediately trapped in new systems of bondage. Under the black codes, formerly enslaved people could be arrested for unemployment, for speaking too loudly, for walking without proper documentation. Once arrested, they were released back to the same plantations they'd supposedly been freed from. This system, called convict leasing, was actually more brutal than slavery. Why? Because companies leasing prisoners didn't own them, so they had no incentive to keep them alive. Men, women, and children were literally worked to death in mines, on railroads, in factories. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free 4 million people, it just moved the bars on their cage. But there was one moment, one brief shining moment, when real freedom seemed possible. January 1865. Hope had a number 40. 40 acres and a mule. Union General William Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, redistributing 400,000 acres of Confederate land to newly freed black families along the Georgia and South Carolina coasts. For the first time in American history, the people who had worked the land for free were being given ownership of that land, and black families believed it. Within weeks, thousands had built homes, planted crops, established communities. It wasn't just a promise. It was a future-taking route, but that future lasted exactly 6 months. President Lincoln was assassinated. His successor, Andrew Johnson, had deep sympathy for Southern plantation owners. Johnson reversed Sherman's order, pardoned the former Confederates, and gave their land back to them. Overnight, black families were evicted from soil they had just begun to call home. Federal soldiers arrived with guns, burned down their houses, destroyed their crops, and drove them away. Again, the promise of 40 acres and a mule was never codified into federal law. It was never protected. It was a dream destroyed by a single signature, and it wasn't just property that was lost. It was legacy. That land could have created generational wealth, been passed down to children, used to build businesses, fund education, survive the century of racial terrorism that followed. Instead, it was stolen. Again now, most people have heard of the Tulsa race massacre, but Tulsa wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic campaign to destroy black economic success wherever it appeared. After slavery, black Americans didn't just survive, they thrived. All-black towns sprouted across the country. Greenwood in Oklahoma, Rosewood in Florida, Nicodemus in Kansas. These communities had black doctors, black-owned newspapers, black banks, black hospitals. They were living proof that black prosperity was possible without white oversight, and that made them targets. In 1921, Greenwood was known as Black Wall Street, one of the wealthiest black communities in America. But over a single weekend, white mobs supported by law enforcement destroyed everything. Planes dropped bombs on residential neighborhoods. Homes and businesses were torched. Over 300 black residents were murdered. Thousands were left homeless, and every insurance claim was denied. But this wasn't an isolated incident. Between 1865 and 1945, over 100 black towns were destroyed by racial violence. In Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, a thriving black-led government was overthrown in the only successful coup in United States history. In Rosewood, Florida, 1923, an entire town was burned to the ground and never rebuilt. Each time, black families lost land, businesses, homes, and lives. Each time, no one was held accountable. These weren't riots. They were state-sanctioned economic sabotage. Imagine what black America could have become if these communities had been allowed to grow, if their wealth had compounded, if their businesses had scaled, if their children had inherited more than ashes. After the fires and massacres, America developed more subtle methods of theft, maps, mortgages, and discriminatory lending practices. From the 1930s through the 1960s, the federal government created color-coded maps to determine loan eligibility. Black neighborhoods were outlined in red and labeled hazardous. This practice was called redlining. If you lived in a redlined area, you couldn't get a mortgage regardless of your income, credit score, or employment history. Meanwhile, white families in the suburbs received low interest, government-backed loans that built wealth for generations. Between 1934 and 1968, 98% of government-backed home loans went to white families. Black families were systematically locked out of home ownership, the primary method Americans used to build wealth. And when some black families managed to move into white neighborhoods, real estate agents employed a scam called blockbusting. They'd terrify white homeowners into selling below market value, claiming property values would plummet once black families moved in. Then they'd resell those same homes to black families at inflated prices with predatory contracts that often didn't include full ownership rights. This pattern continued right through the 2008 housing crisis. Banks specifically targeted black communities with subprime mortgages, even when families qualified for better terms. When the market crashed, black families lost homes at twice the rate of whites. Over 240,000 black families lost their homes. This wasn't a flaw in the system. This was the system working exactly as designed. Here's something that might surprise you. Slavery didn't end with the 13th Amendment. It just changed uniforms. The 13th Amendment contains 27 words that changed everything. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States, except as punishment for crime. That exception became the loophole that birthed mass incarceration immediately after emancipation. Southern states passed black codes making it illegal for black people to be unemployed, to loiter, to speak loudly in public, or to walk without proof of employment. Thousands were arrested, and once labeled criminals, they were leased out to plantations, railroads, and corporations. This system was called convict leasing, and it was more deadly than slavery because companies leasing prisoners didn't own them. They had no incentive to keep them alive. Men, women, and children were worked to death in mines fields, in factories while profits flowed into state treasuries and private pockets. Today, the United States has the world's largest prison population, over 2 million people. Though black Americans represent only 13% of the population, they account for nearly 40% of all incarcerated individuals. Black men are 6 times more likely to be in prison than white men. For black women, it's twice as likely. And once labeled a felon, doors slam shut. You can't vote, can't get housing, can't get jobs. You become legally, economically, and socially erased. But here's what they never mention. Prison is a business. Private prison companies like CoreCivic and GEO Group generate billions annually. Incarcerated people work for as little as 13 cents per hour, producing goods and services for government contracts and major corporations. Prison labor fights wildfires in California, builds furniture for schools, packages food for disaster relief. The public barely notices or cares. In every era, the system found new ways to convert black suffering into profit. Slavery became convict leasing. Convict leasing became Jim Crow. Jim Crow became the war on drugs. Today, it's mass incarceration. This isn't about crime prevention, it's about control and capital. Because in America, black bodies have always meant one thing: profit. But something unprecedented happened in 2020. Amid nationwide protests and a global reckoning on race, California decided to do what the federal government has never done. Reparations. Seriously. California established the first reparations task force in modern American history. Their mission? Study the impact of slavery and systemic racism, then recommend actual monetary compensation for descendants of enslaved people. What they discovered was devastating and undeniable. The task force documented measurable harm in housing, discrimination, over-policing, mass incarceration, health disparities, and unjust property seizures. They calculated costs not just in trauma, but in lost economic opportunity. Their recommendation, up to $1.5 million per eligible black resident. Critics immediately called it too much, too expensive, too divisive. But let's put this in perspective. The United States spent $6.5 trillion on pandemic relief in under 3 years. The annual military budget exceeds $877 billion. Banks received bailouts in 2008 with no arrests, no accountability. So don't claim the money isn't there. The question isn't about affordability, it's about accountability. If you're finding this information valuable, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what surprised you most about this history. 1.5 million isn't a random figure. It's based on data, undocumented loss, unmeasurable harm, and it's still less than what was actually stolen. This proposal represents a blueprint that every state could follow, because the harm wasn't limited to California. Black families were systematically stripped of wealth from coast to coast. Reparations aren't about giving anything extra. They're about restoring what was taken. California did something simple yet revolutionary. It listened, it documented, and it dared to say, yes, this happened, and it's time we pay what's owed. Whenever reparations are discussed, someone always asks, who's going to pay for that? But this question is never asked about military spending, corporate bailouts, or tax breaks for billionaires. In 2023 alone, the United States spent over $877 billion on defense. Since 2001, it spent over $8 trillion on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. No one questioned affordability then. Let's be absolutely clear. Reparations aren't about punishing individual white people. They're about holding a nation accountable. The same government that enforced slavery, segregation, redlining, and mass incarceration can absolutely fund reparations. It's been done before. In 1988, Japanese Americans unjustly interned during World War II received formal apologies and $20,000 each. German Holocaust survivors were compensated by multiple European governments. Even enslaved people's owners in Washington, D.C. received reparations for losing their property, paid by the federal government in 1862. So don't say it's impossible. It's been done. Just not for black people. The truth is, reparations have already been paid, just not to the victims. They were paid to perpetrators, to companies that insured slave ships, to railroads built on black labor, to families who inherited stolen land. And let's discuss cost. The real expense isn't paying black Americans. The real cost is what happens when you don't. Generations of poverty, broken families, crime rooted in desperation, public health crises, education gaps, housing instability. These aren't random failures. They're direct consequences of an unpaid debt. America pays for this every single day through policing, prisons, welfare systems, and lost productivity. When people ask who will pay, here's the answer. We already are. We've been paying the price of injustice for over 400 years. Reparations aren't an expense, they're a correction. Not punishment, but a promise finally kept. Not all debts are financial. Some are carved into memory, into the collective soul of a people. What was stolen from black Americans wasn't just land, money, or opportunity. It was safety, peace, the fundamental right to exist without fear. For over 4 centuries, black families lived under constant threat of separation, violence, annihilation. Mothers watched their children sold. Fathers were beaten in front of their families. Entire bloodlines were erased with a signature or a bullet. How do you quantify the cost of generational trauma? Even today, the scars remain. Black infants are more than twice as likely to die as white infants. Black women are nearly 3 times more likely to die during childbirth. Stress-related illnesses like hypertension and heart disease are epidemic. These aren't genetic defects. They're the result of living under constant pressure, surveillance, and fear. Scientists call it weathering. the physical toll of racism on the human body, and it shortens black lives by decades. Imagine being told you're free, but your skin still marks you for suspicion. Imagine working twice as hard for half the recognition and still being labeled lazy. Imagine losing your child to police violence and watching the killer walk free. This is the emotional cost of injustice. It's not just what happened to our ancestors. It's what their descendants inherited. Black children are taught early how to survive police encounters. Black parents pray harder every time their child leaves home. Entire communities carry the psychological burden of having to prove their humanity daily. That's the debt no one sees. The invisible tax of being black in America. Reparations aren't just about money. They're about acknowledgement, about truth-telling, about saying, we see what was done to you. We understand what it cost, and we will no longer pretend it didn't happen. Until that debt is recognized and paid, the wound remains open. Because a country can't heal from what it refuses to name. Some people hear 1.5 million and think it's excessive, but when you understand what was taken, you realize it's not even close to adequate. No amount of money can undo for centuries of violence, terror, and stolen futures. It won't resurrect lives lost to slavery. It won't rebuild black towns burned to ashes. It won't reverse trauma passed down like family heirlooms, but it can begin something this country has never truly attempted: repair. 1.5 million isn't charity. It's not a lottery ticket. It's a receipt for unpaid labor, denied housing, stolen land, and blocked opportunity. It's the first brick in a foundation that should have been laid centuries ago. Think about what 1.5 million actually means today. For many black families, it could mean finally owning a home without predatory lending. It could mean college education without crushing debt. It could mean starting a business without begging for funding from institutions that never wanted you. This isn't reparations for slavery alone. It's compensation for the aftershocks. Jim Crow, redlining, the war on drugs, mass incarceration, police brutality, medical neglect, educational sabotage. Each system didn't just harm black people. It prevented them from building wealth, from passing something down, from catching their breath. 1.5 million won't fix everything, but it would give black Americans something they've been denied: leverage. For centuries, this country has operated on stolen time and stolen bodies. It has profited from black brilliance while locking black people out of the systems they helped build. So if we're discussing numbers, 1.5 million is the floor, not the ceiling. America will never be able to repay the full debt. But that doesn't mean it gets to pay nothing. This isn't about creating equality overnight. It's about creating justice, finally. It's about acknowledging that this nation's wealth came from unpaid hands. And now those hands are reaching out, not requesting charity, but demanding what they've earned. Before you go, let me know in the comments. Did this change how you view reparations? And make sure you're subscribed, because we're continuing this conversation in next week's video. This isn't just about the past. It's about a bill that remains unpaid. For every dollar in white wealth, there's a black story behind it. A story of forced labor, stolen land, burned homes, blocked loans, denied justice. They say we're asking for handouts. No, we're asking for refunds. The blood, the sweat, the brilliance, the culture, it all came from black hands. We were the labor force. We were the innovation. We were the foundation. And we were never paid. This country has compensated everyone. Except us. It paid banks that collapsed the economy. It paid slave owners for losing their property. It paid for wars, for Wall Street, for bailouts, for bombs. But the people who built the country from the ground up, still waiting. Every time black families tried to rise, the system knocked them down. And still we rose. Still we built. Still we hoped. But hope alone doesn't close wealth gaps. Hope doesn't replace homes lost to redlining. Hope doesn't heal generational trauma. What does? Repair, restitution, reparations. We're not asking America to do something new. We're asking it to do what it already knows how to do: pay its debts. 1.5 million per person isn't the end. It's the beginning of justice, of healing, of truth. Because until this nation confronts what it owes, it will never become what it claims to be. And we will never stop asking, never stop organizing, never stop speaking the names of those who came before us, who worked without pay, who lived without freedom, who died without recognition. This is not just history. This is our receipt, stamped in blood, signed in sacrifice, and long overdue. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.